because whoever controls information controls the world. Michael and I negate contention. One is cybersecurity. Stephanie Wiegel of Carrero Network Security explains IoT devices are poorly managed, patched, and secured, making them sitting ducks for hacker infiltration and takeover. That's why an HP study conservatively estimates that the most common IoT devices are 70% of them are critically vulnerable to cyber attacks. Douglas Bondurant of Security Intelligence writes, the interconnected nature of these technologies means that breaching any device puts cyber criminals within striking distance of critical data. Digital security firm Gemalto explains, identity theft is the primary motive behind these data breaches, accounting for 53% of them. Stilianos Vidalis of the University of Staffordshire furthers, the biggest threat to the success of IoT is ID theft-related crimes. This is why the Homeland Security Committee writes, stolen identities provide criminals, including terrorists, with access to critical infrastructure like nuclear facilities and airports, but also with the funds necessary to finance their operations. That's why Utica College quantifies that 1/3 of total domestic terrorism cases include charges of identity fraud. Thus, Desire Atho of Tech Radar labels the Internet of Things as an identity theft goldmine for terrorists and criminals alike. Contention 2 is surveillance capitalism. According to best-selling author Jeremy Rifkin, major companies are now flexing their muscles to gain control of private IoT data. Rifkin continues, these big businesses are packaging and selling masses of data to other companies which use them to form manipulative marketing strategies. Scott Pepe of the Texas Law Review warns, as the Internet of Things moves from small startups to large established players, those players will have vast power to shape the industry. The impact of this industry shaping is price discrimination. Maria Farrell of The Guardian writes, the entire point of combining sensor and object data in the Internet of Things is to tell which businesses are high-value customers and which aren't. Catherine Crump of the ACLU notes, not very surprisingly, this has already led to discriminatory behavior by retailers. An investigation by the Wall Street Journal found that several online retailers changed their prices based on what customers were viewing. They found customers who lived in higher income areas received lower prices because their customer loyalty was better. It was viewed as more valuable. But this discrimination goes a lot further than just health insurance. In fact, Scott Pepe finds again that in the future, insurance companies could use the data collected from the Internet of Things to discover which individuals are most at risk of health conditions and charge them higher insurance premiums. Because these people are most likely to be lower income people, as lower income people are higher to be at risk, that means that you're charging lower income people higher healthcare insurance premiums, which runs the risk of pushing them out of the healthcare sector altogether. Contention 3 is Big Brother. Right now, the world is trending away from autocracy, but that all changes when you institute the Internet of Things. David Bolton of ApplePause finds that 40% of IoT market value is going to be generated in developing countries by 2020. But Mark Schiffbauer of the University of Bonn writes that most of these developing countries are dictatorships. Shanti Kalafil of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace furthers. Authoritarian regimes are actively promoting an internet that serves state-defined interest. Unfortunately, these harms extend to the Internet of Things as well, which is why the National Endowment for Democracy finds that the Internet of Things will just be another tool for social control in authoritarian countries. For example, Ellie Dorado of the Mercatus Center finds that authoritarian regimes like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and China are already lobbying the UN and forcing them to implement an oversight commission that allows them to pervasively and persistently track their citizens. Possible uses include digitally enabled smart surveillance cameras that track political dissidents or citizens submitting to forced microchip implants. This entrenches authoritarianism because democratization is best achieved without spying, which is why Thom Hartmann of Truthout explains without privacy, there is no such thing as democracy.
Before cross, can I see the Vaughan evidence?
Sure.
Is that dictatorship?
Yeah.
Good.
Is there anything more specific on this, or is this just online?
That's exactly what
All right, that's.
ready? Connor?
Yep.
Okay, so you talk about how identity theft with the Internet of Things is this really big deal. How many people's identities have been stolen as of the status quo because of the IoT?
Well, this resolution isn't just about the status quo.
Well, I would argue that if it hasn't happened before, and we've had IoT for a pretty long time, then, like, what is the reason why it would happen in the future? Like, if we don't have
Because
this
when you
whole-
have more of it, the problem gets worse, right? Like, here's
that
an
implies that there's a problem in the
here's
first
an
place,
here's
right?
an analogy, right?
Sure.
In like 2006, we had a housing market for a very long time, right? We invested in housing market bonds for a really long time, and everything was great, right? But eventually, it reached the tipping point where there was so much that everything fell apart, right? Like that's the housing crisis. So
I
the
think the
analogy.
housing crisis had more to do with like banks giving out loans.
Yeah,
but
no,
then
no,
that's
no,
like
but
the actual
yeah,
point of the
here's
question.
the analogy,
How
right?
many have there been now? Like you
Okay.
say it's going to increase, but unless you prove that there have been any cases of this happening right now,
So we
then
don't.
how is there
So
going to
we
be
don't
increase?
provide any examples of it happening right now. That doesn't discredit the arguments because there's no reason we can't look to like implications in the future. But can I ask you a question?
Sure.
In your first contention, you talk about decreased pollution, specifically in China.
Mhm.
What has China done, other than implement IoT sensors? Because you told me that they've implemented IoT sensors, which makes them have better policy. So what policy changes have they done?
Yeah, so it's really simple actually. These sensors aren't like temperature sensors or anything. They actually measure the amount of these pollutants that
Yeah,
are
like
in the
fine
air.
particulate matter.
The fine particulate matter, yes. So when you're able to pinpoint exactly where the fine particulate matter is coming from and see exactly where it's going, that means that we can use effective legislation to reduce it.
So
And
what
it's
has
specifically because
So
of that.
what has China actually done? Because you say like fine particulate matter has gone down. So what have they done?
China has specifically targeted the places with the most fine particulate matter in the first 3 quarters of last year, and they found a 20% reduction when they were using these
what
IoT
policies
sensors.
have they passed?
The IoT sensors are the
No,
only way.
what policy has China made as a result of the IoT data?
It's not like specific policy. It's the fact that the Chinese government in Beijing was specifically able to implement these devices and see where the particulate matter was the highest, so they knew exactly where to focus on.
I would contend that the reason you see particulate matter going down is because sensors are tampered with. Indeed, the Washington Post will tell you that when you look at Chinese air quality sensors, the reason that fine particulate matter went down is because the people operating them literally stuffed cotton in front of them to filter the air.
What city was that in?
Xi'an.
Yeah, Xi'an. Was there any in Beijing?
I mean, I
Were
don't know.
there any in the other
right?
27 countries that we talk about?
But
no.
here-
They
here's
arrested
what's
5
important.
people. They arrested 5 people that were doing it alone. It wasn't like a Chinese government
Okay,
thing. 5 people alone in Xi'an, which is very
Yeah,
far
yeah.
away from
But
Beijing,
here's
tampered with
what's
evidence.
im-
We talk about Beijing.
Here's
Can I
what's
ask you a
important.
question?
No, no.
We
Can I
spent about a
really-
minute. We spent a minute on this. Can I
Okay,
please ask
fine.
a question really
Sure.
quickly? So you talk about how big companies are going to sell the data in the future, right? And price discrimination is going to happen. Where has price discrimination happened specifically because of the IoT?
We read you that evidence in case. But
Yeah,
like, do you want me to
is that
tell
internet? Like you read the Washington Post that talks about in 2006. That was related specifically to internet websites looking up socioeconomic information to display the higher prices. Did that have anything to do with the IoT?
I would argue that IoT makes it far worse, which is why like the Crump evidence we read you in case
You
tells
would-
you empirically that.
Yeah, you would argue, but has it actually happened materialized?
I mean, once again, I would say that impacts that haven't happened yet aren't necessarily wrong, but we're
That's a minute 1 total. Okay, just starting at the top. All right. Is everyone good? start with our first contention on cybersecurity. A few things to keep in mind. First, Stanley of the ACLU explains that cybersecurity firms tend to exaggerate the impacts of what the Internet of Things actually has vulnerabilities. In fact, their own HP evidence, we would argue, is really, really misleading because we would say that number is a lot lower and they're trying to exaggerate for more profits. But second, Howard of Palo Alto explains that the majority of these vulnerabilities can actually be solved really, really easily. This is really important because when consumers and businesses realize that they're losing money and they realize that they're losing privacy, they're prompted to act. In fact, Cisco explains that businesses have reacted to this issue of vulnerabilities and the Internet of Things and have actually taken increased security spending measures in order to fix the gaps. In fact, CV explains that since the Internet of Things has been implemented, there's been a 47% increase in security spending. We would argue that yes, maybe cybersecurity is an issue in the short term, but that's all it is. It won't extend to long-term impacts because these devices will continue to be hacked. But then they try to impact to ID theft, and essentially they say that we're going to lead to an access to nuclear facilities. We would argue this is a general nuclear facilities in general. They don't give you a single reason or single way in which the Internet of Things is being implemented in these nuclear facilities or anything to do with terrorism. At that point, their last impact card, about 1/3 of all domestic terrorism incidents being caused by these breaches, literally has no standing because they don't gain a link to the Internet of Things specifically, make them proven implementation. Go to their second contention where they talk about surveillance. And essentially they say is that corporations are now getting data on us and now they can track us with every move. But first, Naughton of The Guardian explains that corporations already had control of our data. They look at our internet searches, they look at our Google searches, they look at our Facebook. They already have sufficient data in order to track us and in order to make sure that we that they can control what prices to give. They're not unique to the Internet of Things and they don't prove a drastic increase in the amount of price discrimination specifically because of the Internet of Things. But I would argue that price discrimination doesn't necessarily happen because of the Internet of Things, right? They can't track using agricultural sensors or water pumps necessarily means that we can find people's locations or what their prices are on healthcare. It has nothing to do with the Internet of Things, but rather Google searches and location. But then they talk about this idea of changing in prices, and they give you this whole idea that there's a study conducted on price discrimination. But they don't give you a magnitude or scope of the impact. Yes, there might have been small price discrimination, but they don't give you a reason why that outweighs our impacts to poverty or why that matters in the round, in the big scope of the round, even if they impact to a few people. On their third contention, they talk about Big Brother. There's a lot of issues with this argument. First, they really give you no examples on a broad scope. Yes, they say that Russia and China are lobbying to the United Nations to create increased surveillance. But great, a lot of countries lobby to a lot of different people in order to get different things. But that doesn't necessarily mean those things are passed. We would argue that the UN is much behind the Internet of Things because they realize the significant benefits that it has produced. In fact, we would argue that the UN is behind the precision agriculture, the water infrastructure technology that is currently being implemented in the status quo. But second, they say is that these authoritarian governments are going to control all the technology. But we would argue that the status quo evidence disproves their claim, right? We're seeing that there's implementation of these precision agriculture technologies. There's implementation of these water pumps, meaning that they're not necessarily controlling all the technologies that are getting into their countries. But then they read this Bond evidence, and they say that most developing countries are dictatorships. First, it's a really broad, just one line that says developing countries are dictatorships. I would say that A, they're transitioning away from dictatorships, and the Internet of Things doesn't necessarily allow them to, doesn't necessarily stop them from doing so. But B, this doesn't necessarily mean that they control all the data that's coming in, right? There's a lot of developing countries that might be authoritarian in Africa. They still allow aid, and they still allow things to benefit their citizens. But then they say that they're promoting internet for state control of everything. But they don't give you a single way in which this is unique to the Internet of Things, right? Countries like China and Russia currently censor the internet in the status quo. They don't need the Internet of Things to control how people's lives work. They don't tell you why a single Internet of Things device or a single machine-to-machine communication is going to impact citizen surveillance. At the end, they say without democracy, without privacy, we have no democracy. This is a really ridiculous claim. Make them pursue any decrease in democracy in the long term. For all those reasons, I see nothing but an affirmation.
Just going to be done with this. Yep.
Let's start off with their first contention about reducing pollution. The first main problem here is they're telling you that the data generated from IoT devices is really good at making these solutions, right? But we would tell you that it's not good at pinpointing these problems and finding solutions. According to Peter Bison and McKinsey Global Institute, he finds in 2015 that most of the IoT data collected today is not used at all, and data that is used isn't being fully exploited. That's why George Leopold of Datanami writes that the dirty little secret about big data from the Internet of Things is that nobody actually knows what to do with it. Even if they're generating data, isn't it being used to implement special policy solutions to solve those?
leads me to my second response, which is that they only garner an impact on solving these climate change if they implement solutions. Rohan asked them in First Crossfire, what has China done to solve these issues? And they literally cannot tell you, right? At that point, you can't value what they're saying. Just the fact that we have sensors showing where the pollution is, if nothing is done to solve that pollution issue, then no decreases in climate change actually occur. And this is really critical because specifically on China, Edward Wong of the New York Times tells you that the reason why we're seeing decreases in the emissions is because officials are tampering with the monitoring equipment, not because we're solving the solution. And he tells you this is actually indicative of a larger trend. But then on the third main problem, we would contend that concurrent factors can solve back for all of the problems we're talking about. Right now, we would say that climate awareness is going up. That's why the Paris Agreement last Friday was signed by 197 different countries. We already see that we're solving back for these problems. We don't need the Internet of Things at all. Fourth of all, and most importantly, they make the issue worse. Their internal link is this climate change issue, but they're going to make it worse for two reasons. A, because when we have connecting IoT devices and we're giving them internet connectivity, that allows a lot of new devices to be connected to the electrical grid. For example, toasters are now going to have a new, completely different connectivity when we add internet connectivity. But B, Internet of Things devices need to always be on standby. When you have things like motion sensors, those need to be able to detect when you walk into the room. That means that they're always on standby. That means they're always on. At that point, this is why Alex Kirby of the Climate News Network tells you in 2016 that the Internet of Things will lead to an uncontrollable demand of energy and spiraling emissions on carbon dioxide. And that's why he quantifies that the share of global energy that the Internet of Things will consume will increase by 3% every single year. They're making all of the problems they talk about worse. Now I'll go to the second section, which talks about boosting development. The first point is about agriculture. Three main problems. The first, there's a problem with agriculture right now in food scarcity is distribution, not production. Ellen Messer of the United Nations University writes in 2000 that the problem with food scarcity is not production, but rather the distribution of goods. If they tell you that some places in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, can't grow food because they're living in desert areas, they don't solve that problem simply by giving censored data. But second of all, we would argue that it's too expensive. David Curry of Rewrite tells you in 2016 that the Internet of Things is much too expensive in developed countries, much less developing. Make them show they can solve these problems. Moreover, it doesn't work. The 15% increase in agricultural productivity is just a magazine article saying this. It's not based on any empirics. But third of all, we would say that if they do increase yield, it's a really bad thing because the Internet of Things is first going to be implemented in developed countries, not developing. And when developed countries see higher yields, they ship their overproduced goods to developing countries, which ActionAid tells you is a really bad thing because those goods that are coming from developed and pouring into developing countries are sold at lower prices, which means farmers within those countries can't compete with the low prices, which means the smallholder farmers are driven out of business. They can't solve there. But then, on their second point about water, the first main problem is that all of their evidence saying it's working is about test trials. Two problems here. A, businesses have a financial incentive to report success. There's no reason to buy their evidence. But B, we would contend that it's not going to be implemented on a large scale. Yusilia Wang of the Wall Street Journal explains that these smart water sensors that they're talking about and other things cost about $300. There's no way smallholder farmers can actually implement any of the programs they're talking about. But third of all, she tells you that what actually happens with these things is there's a lot of conservation efforts in water going on at the same time. That's why she finds that these studies can't conclude causality and show whether or not it's these smart water systems or other factors that are leading to this. But on the third point about trade, it's a logical leap. They tell you that there's increased efficiency on planes when we're shipping the goods, but that does not conclude with their evidence. Their evidence at the bottom, impact evidence, is saying that when we have better trade relations, that increases GDP and decreases poverty. That doesn't mean that when we have easier efficiency, that leads to those impacts.
Okay. I see two parts when they're doing that. First, the tampering is significant, signifying a larger trend. And then where do you say that we can't prove causality with water?
This is water. Can you get your cross?
Rohan, do you need your computer?
I don't need my cross.
Yeah, you can have your cross.
Is everyone ready? So let's talk about your China evidence again, right? Is it like talking about like specific cities, or we're talking about like China in
It
general?
talks about the one city in which they found the evidence of tampering very recently,
Okay,
but
sure.
then at the bottom it says
Does it mean that there were no reductions overall?
I'm saying we can't determine whether or not there were reductions specifically because of the IOT.
Okay, would you say
right?
that yeah, sure.
Alright, so let's talk about your responses to our third contention.
Yeah.
You say Russia and China are lobbying, but they lobby all the time, and the UN is going to prevent them from actually implementing this.
Yeah,
Why
that's-
is that?
Because like the UN doesn't have like incentives for like authoritarian regimes to like gain power.
No, but
right?
I'm
like
saying
that's
the
like not like
authoritarian
an
regimes
incentive
can
like
do it
of
by
what the United
themselves,
Nations
right?
does.
The UN does not control what
Okay,
Russia and
well,
China want to do in these other
I would say that if the
regimes.
United Nations is aware that like they're going to use this technology, then they're like really not going to allow them to
That's
do so.
just like saying
right?
there should be no human rights abuses because the UN should theoretically solve for all of them.
No,
right?
but they go out and they try to solve human
That's
rights
not true.
abuses.
What has the UN done in Eritrea or these other authoritarian
I
regimes?
don't know. Can you tell me?
No, they haven't done
But like I don't know, they're at least trying to do something, right? They're not gonna like it doesn't matter about like if something's actually happening in the governments. They're not going to actively
UN is
try to
not going
promote
to,
like further harm.
Go upon and violate
Okay,
like state
sure.
sovereignty.
Even if this is true, how many like governments like authoritarian regimes actually apply
Yeah,
to?
we tell you most developing countries.
Okay,
are
it says like dictate like
It's an
okay.
empirical study.
Does that mean that technology's not getting there?
What? No,
does that
I'm
mean that
saying
technology-
is getting there, but only in the way that the dictators want it to.
Okay, but like why? Right? Like we're seeing
Because
implementation
they're
in the status
dictators.
quo.
What?
We're seeing like implementation in the status quo. We're seeing like poor people like
The
benefit.
problem with implementation in the status quo is you can tell me that some businesses are going to some developing countries and implementing it. But that doesn't
Not
mean that-
necessarily, right? Like there's like more
That is.
trade like overall. Like that's still
Okay,
a
let's
benefit.
talk about trade.
Yeah,
How do
sure.
you get to more trade?
What?
How do you access the impact
More
of stronger
efficiency,
trade
like more
relations?
production,
No.
more efficiency.
Your
like-
impact evidence at the bottom is saying stronger trade relations leads to like increased GDP and all of that, right?
Yeah, sure.
Does the fact that a plane takes like
Wait,
30 less minutes
it's not
to
a
get to a
plane.
place?
It's not a plane. It's
What
about
is
like
the argument?
manufacturing efficiency and like how much they can like go through the supply chain, like how efficient the products.
So
get.
I'd like to articulate like an example of this. Like what is an example of an IoT device that would increase efficiency?
I'm not sure. I would say that just like one device that allows for like a supply, like things to move through the supply chain much quicker.
How
Right?
does
Like
it
the
move through
transmission
the
of like
supply chain much
right,
faster?
like
How does it do that?
it takes a lot of time for like one good to move to like another country.
Okay, so
right?
it's
Like,
transportation then.
Like not necessarily, right?
Then
It's
what
like
is
the
it?
it's like the processing of the products also. Like we'll get to it further in the summary. All right, can I ask you about like your whole thing on water infrastructure?
Yeah.
So you say that like corporations have like an incentive to report success. Like does that detract from the fact that like this has empirically been proven?
I'm saying we shouldn't weigh it that heavily, but I think the more important response is that the weighing evidence tells you that we can't actually determine the causality in this, right?
Okay, why though? Like what's the
because
reason?
there are a
for
lot
that?
of conservation efforts going on at the same time. For example, drought-resistant plants and other
But if
water-based
these
plants
people are like,
that aren't
if these
connected
people
to-
only get get their water from like the specific hand pumps that are broken all the time,
No, but
then would you
the
say that
wa-
any more access to water is like on net a benefit?
You don't prove to me that they get more water conservation is what I'm saying.
Okay, we're gonna.
Yeah.
That's all.
Okay, so I'm gonna start on their side of the flow, then I'm gonna go on to ours and voters. Let's start on their third contention about Big Brother. Oh, wait, 1 second, sorry, I set my timer to the wrong time. Let's look to their third contention on Big Brother. Remember a few things Jonah tells you that are going to be very important in the rest of the round.
First of all, these things are already happening in the status quo without Internet of Things. The governments are still spying. Governments are doing this in the status quo. They need to prove why it's inherently different than things that are happening right now. Then second, the only example they give is Russia lobbying the UN. Russia lobbies the UN to take away sanctions, but we still haven't done that. Russia does a lot of things, and authoritarian dictatorships do lots of things like that, but it doesn't mean that they're going to get passed, and they haven't proved any probability as to why this is going to happen. Now, let's go on to reasons why you could vote for us off air pollution. We're going to make this very clear. The first thing he says is they're not good at pinpointing. If we've already decreased emissions by 20% by pinpointing the exact locations and making steps to get the factories to not pollute as much, that means that we're going to be doing this in the status quo. He's not giving you like a theoretical impact in the future. Then he says that it's being tampered with and that it signifies a larger trend. The larger trend evidence literally says that they took down a documentary in China that was talking about polluting stuff. It doesn't say larger trend. It's talking about taking down a documentary that people were up in arms about. Not that at all. Then let's talk about all of this stuff about cotton for a second. Cotton only happened. 5 people were arrested in Xi'an, not Beijing. All the evidence that we're talking about is specific to Beijing. Then he gives this response that like everything's connected to the grid, so it's going to use more energy. There's a term for this. It's Greenwald, who tells us that these devices are going to be 7 times more energy efficient than the energy they expend. So we're on net going to see a decrease in energy consumption. We're going to be getting the impacts of decreasing the emissions all in 27 different countries, and we're going to be cutting pollution-related deaths by 15%. Then he says the Paris Agreement is going to like show support without the IoT. But the Paris Agreement doesn't mean that they can't use IoT, and I would argue that a lot of these countries are implementing IoT like China to decrease their emissions, which is empirically happening and is empirically true. Then let's go to water infrastructure. The first thing he says is that it's too large of a scale and it costs too much. First of all, we've already lifted 5 million people out of poverty. These things can be given as aid. It doesn't have to be like the farmers buying them or the people in the areas buying them. Then he says that like we can't do it and that it doesn't work in the status quo. His arguments are about water meters, about toilets, nothing to do with smart pumps in Africa. Their water meters are just measuring how much water goes through, while smart pumps are telling them specifically which pumps are broken so they could go and fix them. Water meters and water pumps are 2 completely separate issues.
Can we see Greenwald?
Sure.
Is everybody ready? First, on framework, you're going to weigh authoritarian regimes the most important impacts on the ground, so they preclude our opponents' impacts from happening. Businesses might be able to go in and put in like one smart water meter system to like field test their equipment, but at the end of the day, people still have to be able to buy it, and under authoritarian regimes, they're precluded from doing so. Here's why you vote for our opponents on their first contention. First of all, the Leopold response that tells you corporations don't know how to use IoT data in order to improve systems. The best idea of this is the fact that throughout today's round, they have provided you a total of 0 examples of how in China they've made policy policy better, right? We would contend that when fine particulate matter is magically going down in the absence of any policy change, it's probably an example of tampering, right? The logical steps aren't that large. It makes sense. If they can't provide you a policy change, there's no reason that particulate matter would go down. But also extend the climate change turn, which talks about how you're increasing energy usage. The response theory to this is just about machine-to-machine connections and like ICT technology in general. It's not specific to the Internet of Things. Our evidence is, and it tells you when you connect 1 billion devices to an energy grid, you increase the amount of electricity you need. But on their second contention, the only thing they extend is water. Extend Michael's response from weighing that tells you there's multiple things going on right now, so you can't actually prove causality. They say it's talking about smart meters specifically. Wang is talking about big data from water conservation in general. But at the end of the day, smart meters and smart pumps aren't actually that different. So if you buy their response, you don't vote for them. But here's why you vote for us. On our third contention about Berggruen, they put a lot of responses. First of all, the idea that the responses they extended that there's no examples of broad scope, but we tell you the majority of developing countries aren't free. They're in fact dictatorships. That is large scope. Then they tell you, oh, why is this unique to Internet of Things? It is, right? Oppression is a scalar impact. Things like GPS microchip implants increase surveillance. Things like smart cameras that are able to track political dissidents increase surveillance. Things like that are important because they preclude our opponents' impacts from happening. Here's why. No authoritarian regime is ever going to implement water technology to help their citizens. At that point in time, they're making the most disadvantaged people in the world worse, and they're just increasing inequality, and that's why you negate.
Is everyone ready for cross? Yeah. Okay. Do governments necessarily implement everything that goes on in the country?
I would argue they can control what products go in. Yes.
So what's been stopped so far from getting in and out?
I mean, I would argue that that Internet of Things hasn't reached the point where it's like going to developing countries.
Well, it's
So
it's
wait,
working
so
right
in
now.
Africa, in Kenya, we didn't see like 5
So
million
here's
here's
the
That
difference,
didn't
right?
happen.
Yeah, so here's the difference, right? Like you're talking about field test trials, right?
Okay, but
Where-
sure, but
no,
like,
no,
even if-
no, let me explain why this is important, right? That's talking about a business going to one country and like creating a test trial. But your impacts really come from the idea that it goes commercial and consumers are purchasing it or it goes to
Sure.
other countries.
Can you
And when
prove
it
to me an
goes
example of
commercial-
when something was stopped?
No, we're telling you it hasn't gotten to the commercial point. So there's no reason
But we've
it
had the
would
Internet of
stop.
Things for 6 years. Like we've seen like
They're not
widespread
selling
benefits in
it.
like a lot of
These
sectors.
corporations are insane.
Well,
Here, buy
wait,
this
also,
water
That's not
meter and
responsive.
water
That's not
pump for
responsive to the
$300.
fact that it can be given as things like aid. Like they don't have to buy all the pumps and meters
The problem
themselves.
is, like, we can't provide aid to all of these developing farmers or developing
Okay.
people living in
Yeah,
developing
So even if you
countries,
say it precludes some people, does helping 5 million people
It
come out of
precludes
poverty
why?
not matter?
Sorry?
So like, if we're pulling 5 million people out of poverty, like let's say theoretically it couldn't get into some places. As long as we're helping 5 million people come out of poverty, is that like not a big impact to you guys?
I would argue that the authoritarian regimes outweighs, because at the point where you're like making authoritarian regimes fundamentally worse.
So this is like a really like hypothetical thing that like
I don't think it's
possibly
hypothetical.
happen.
Your only example is like
Because,
Russia
like, you say-
lobbying the UN. How close is Russia to passing the UN
It
resolution?
is not about passing
This is
legislation.
about-
Wait.
Here's the thing,
Right.
The evidence we cite says that there's a forum that the UN holds, and then each country can send representatives to announce visions for what they want
Okay, but-
with implementing the Internet.
The majority of your links
UN
though,
passing
the majority of
legislation.
your links though come off of past like examples, right? Like the governments use the internet to like manage citizens, right? Why is the Internet of Things like going to like be like the same?
So let me explain this to you, right? Like the internet's increased authoritarianism because countries are able to surveil their citizens
Yeah,
more.
the internet,
right?
they like with
Yeah, yeah.
censorship online, like they can do these things.
No,
But
this
not
is
with like
important.
water
No,
technology.
this is important because A, you can't fiat that it's only water technology. You have to look at the Internet of Things holistically. But B, and more importantly, when you're looking at the Internet of Things, it increases the amount of mass data collection, right? It's hard to develop like big strategies from that, but it's really easy to say, hey, this is a political dissident, I'm going to kill them. And that's what authoritarian regimes do.
So how often have they done it because of an increase in data availability?
No,
That is not our argument, right? We are
it's
saying
an argument that
I mean,
has.
like, tell me if I'm misunderstanding. Your argument is that with the availability of more data, authoritarian regimes are going to use it to oppress people.
Yes.
So wherever has an increase in data, specifically like to this, about the entire
It's a bit late in the
it
round to
happens
bring.
in China,
Yeah.
like, right, in 2008 they saw the biggest expansions of internet access, and then they saw a 2 times increase in the number of indictments.
Like,
on
was
But
that
it's the
correlational?
internet, right? Like this
Well, that's the
But you just
fact
asked
that
us
it
for an
says-
example.
The fact that it says that it's the internet shows us that the probability that they're going to use the Internet of Things to do the same thing is very high, right? And also we contend that oppression is scalar, right? It can get worse.
Starting us away, alright? I'll get back to his weighing and after. Is everyone ready? You're going to be looking at probability. In the world of the Internet of Things, every single impact is really, really hypothetical and unpredictable in the future. But when you can look to right now, the only things that are being seen are benefits in developing countries, and we're not seeing harms. Their entire argument about regime change, sure, even if it happens, it's really, really unpredictable and really, really improbable for these things to happen. You're looking to what happens right now. Move on to regime change, like regimes and like the whole Big Brother argument. First, they don't give you a single example of what's being censored or not allowed into these countries right now. At that point, I would argue that the implementation in the status quo isn't being proven. But second, they say that like the internet is the same thing as the Internet of Things. But realize with the internet, governments can censor people online and do other things that the Internet of Things doesn't necessarily allow them to do. They don't make the same link here. They don't gain access to the impacts. But then third, their only other example is China and Russia, like lobbying the United Nations for surveillance. Realize that they haven't passed anything, and the United Nations is really unlikely to pass anything because they don't support these type of programs. At the end of the day, even if you buy a single impact of a Big Brother, we would argue that this like completely outweighed by these specific status quo examples that we give you of implementation to citizens. At the end of then lastly, they say that governments won't implement these programs, but we would argue that A, corporations implement these programs, but B, citizens also buy these programs, so governments aren't always necessarily to implement every single Internet of Things technology. Move on to our first contention. They say, again, their only extension is that the companies and cities don't know how to use this data and they don't implement policy changes. But he contradicts himself because in rebuttal he says that there's other factors leading to a decrease in pollution. Right? We would argue that these sensors are contributing at least to some extent of a decrease in pollution. That's why in China, specifically with Internet of Things technology, in Beijing, which didn't use cotton balls, we saw a 20% reduction in pollution. This leads to a future impact of 18% reduction in emissions. Look to it right now, and it's indicative of a larger trend. But then on water infrastructure, he says that smart pumps and water meters are the same thing. We would argue it's completely different. Smart pumps monitor how much water you're using, like water meters monitor how much water you're using. Smart pumps are looking for these specific pumps. These pumps break down a lot of the time, and we're impacting to the majority of people. They say people being pulled out of poverty doesn't prove the impact. We would argue otherwise because people are benefiting right now, and that's why you're affirming.
Let's start off on pollution. Remember what Rohan puts the burden on them to do in his summary. He tells you with the Leopold card that right now we're generating a lot of data from the Internet of Things, but we don't actually know how to translate that into developing strategies to solve the problems that they're specifically telling you about. That's why they can't tell you and give you a single example in today's debate round about how these policies are actually being implemented from the Internet of Things data. The 20% reduction, we tell you, is because of other factors, not the Internet of Things. But the Kirby response that they never really respond to tells you that the Internet of Things will lead to a net increase of 3% in global consumption of energy every single year that it's implemented, right? This is really important because their Greenwald turn that they say there's 10 times more efficiency isn't talking about the Internet of Things. Our evidence is. When you add a new layer of connectivity to all of these devices, that turns their entire case. That's the best link into lives that they're talking about. But then second of all, on water, they tell you that 5 million people were lifted out. But the weighing evidence that they don't really respond to, beyond saying that it's just meters, tells you that there's no causality, right? Wang is specifically talking about data from conservation efforts, data from Internet of Things conservation efforts. It's not specific just to the meters. The bigger thesis of what it's saying is that since there are a lot of conservation efforts going on at the same time, we literally have no idea whether it's the smart water pumps or smart water meters that are reducing or that are increasing water conservation, or whether it's these other things. But then they're telling you that businesses can provide this. But we would contend that for it to be implemented on a large scale, people have to be able to commercially buy, which they can't because they're living in developing countries that don't have the money. But the third and most important way you're going to be looking to us is our big brother contention. We both agree that some form of the Internet of Things is going to developing countries. And we tell you through the UN example, we establish the probability that it is our type of the Internet of Things. Because they tell you that the UN won't pass legislation. That is not what our evidence is talking about. It's saying that the UN holds a forum, and these countries are sending representatives to advance their vision of what they want the Internet of Things to be. It's not about the UN passing legislation. It's about the countries telling the UN what they're going to do, regardless of what the UN wants. That's why the National Endowment of Democracy tells you it's going to be a tool for social control. And that applies everything. Because in the long term, if you want to save lives and provide the sustainable livelihoods for these people, you have to ensure that there's a structural change and these dictators actually implement social solutions and save their people.